my new book on death, dying, and disbelief. And as I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm going to actually just go ahead and jump straight in because I always have these sort of introductory slides. But a little bit about me. If you've seen me before, you've heard about me before, you this is not new information to you. That my religious background, I was raised a Jehovah's Witness until maybe about fifth grade or so. I stopped studying around that time. And when I got to middle school, I started going to the Methodist church with my dad's side of the family. So like my aunt and some cousins and people like that. We started going to like the family church, basically what was the family church. And I got confirmed in the church and I sang in the choir and went to Bible study and did all of that stuff in middle school. And then I got to high school and I got a little high school boyfriend, got me a little job, got a little car. And so I was living my best life in high school and I, fell out of church, stopped going to church. My sister got married to a minister and a pastor, and so that's how I ended up getting involved in the more extreme religion where I became ordained, and I was getting into prophesying and casting out demons and fasting for 5-10 days at a time. That was the more. That's where I kind of started getting into the more extreme things. One thing I like to point out, and a lot of people that I know say some of the same things, right? That becoming an atheist, becoming a non-believer was really an intellectual process, right? It wasn't like an emotional, I got mad one day because my whole world was falling apart. And so, forget you, God. It wasn't like that, right? It was that I had more questions about what was going on. And I wanted to actually feel like I wanted to get closer to God. I wanted to have a better understanding of Him. And I started to study more and more and more. And I basically just studied myself right on out of religion. That's pretty much what happened. And so these are some other of organizations that I'm affiliated with and that I engage with. I'm also in Women versus Religion, the case against faith and for freedom. That's a collection of essays that were written, all written by women that focus on women's issues. So it's a really interesting, like I said, collection of essays. And then, of course, the Ebony Exodus Project, which is my first book. So, why did I write on death, dying, and disbelief? That high school boyfriend that I just mentioned to you. This is him. This is my first prom that I ever went to. He died in 2019. And so around the first anniversary of his death, I was I was just so overcome with grief. It was such a difficult process for me. I was because we had both got married and had kids and both divorced, and we reconnected later in life, of course, and we had gotten really close again. And so his death was extremely devastating to me, to say the least. And so around that 1 year anniversary, I just the grief kind of overtook me again in a way that I wasn't expecting. And so I sort of felt like I need to do something with this. Like, what can I do? And I thought, I'm a writer. I'm a mental health professional. Um, I've helped people with grief before. What are the things that people need to know about grief? And so that was pretty much where I was at. I thought, this we need this information. Somebody needs to compile this, and somebody specifically needs to compile it for non-believers. At the same time that I was going through what I was going through, I was also supporting two friends who were also grieving the loss of very important people in their lives. And so while I'm trying to deal with my own, I'm supporting two non-believing friends who are also going through their issues. And, we're all sort of talking about, what it's like being a non-believer and going through this process that often feels like a very spiritual process to a lot of people, grieving and death and, oh, somebody's watching over you from heaven sort of thing, right? And so it's like, we need something to sort of deal with this process as non-believers. And so, and then also just as a speaker and a therapist and a, person who travels around the country and does this stuff, you know, I have gotten lots of questions, comments, concerns that have been expressed to me over the years. And so that was another reason why I wrote the book, was to sort of address some of the things that I've heard over the years. So these are the 10 tips. And even though I know you can read, I'm going to read them anyway. I've had somebody comment to me one time. I tend to read a lot of the stuff on the screens anyway. And, I've had some people say to me, and why, why you read everything? We can read. But then one time I had somebody who was visually impaired point out to me that, not everybody can read everything on the screen. It's very good for you to read everything on the screen. So that reinforced to me the need to read everything on the screen. So if you're one of those people that get mad at the presenter for reading everything on the screen, think about that. So anyway, so these are the 10 tips, right? Yes, you can grieve without there being a deeper supernatural meaning. Be patient with yourself and your spiritual love. I'm sorry, be patient with your spiritual loved ones. Take care of your physical self. Take care of you. Number 4 is attend to your psychological and emotional needs. Tip 5 is there is no time limit on grief. Be patient with yourself. 6 is reconnect with nature. 7, postpone major decisions. 8, do something in their honor. 9, cry, then cry some more. And 10 is caring for others who are grieving. So the first 9 really are more directed towards the person who's grieving, right? And then tip 10 is more directed towards somebody who's maybe not themselves grieving, but they're trying to support somebody who's grieving. One of the things that I talk about in the book, I point out that I'm specifically talking to people who are grieving the death of a person. However, these tips and these things can be applied to many situations, because losing an animal or losing a job or breaking up from a relationship, a lot of the things that we experience, a lot of the ways that grief manifests itself because of death, we experience the same types of grief in all kinds of situations. And so a lot of these things may actually prove meaningful to people in all kinds of situations, and not just the death of a person. But I do say in the book that I am speaking particularly to people who are mourning the death of somebody. The 5 stages of grief are very popular, so I do talk about those in the book. The 5 stages being anger, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I talk about how they don't go in order, how you can sort of go in and out of these stages in minutes, and how the acceptance is not an end goal. Acceptance is more about kind of incorporating this person and their memory and your history with that person into your life in a new kind of way, accepting that they're not going to be there for you in the way that you have historically been used to. So how can they be incorporated in your life moving forward? And so that's more about what acceptance is about, because you're never going to be okay with the loss, right? Like, I'm never going to be okay with having lost my high school sweetheart. It's never going to be, my life is never going to be the same. I'm never going to be okay with it. But I can learn to, incorporate his memory and the things that I learned from him, and you know, the life that we share. I can incorporate those things into my life in a new sort of way. So that's sort of what acceptance is all about. So this is a real picture, guys. I don't know if you ever. This is an actual selfie after a funeral that I was attending, and I was so hungry. This is what it's actually like. If you've never been to a black funeral, they're so long, you will starve. Take you some candies, couple peppermints, something, keep your blood sugar up, because you're going to struggle. That's my little joke. Okay. So, one of the things, so what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is just briefly touch on what were my favorite tips from the book, right? So again, like I said, there were 10 tips. A few of them were my favorite ones, right? I'm a little partial to a few of them. And so that's what I want to do, is talk to you about the ones that were my favorite tips. So the first one is, yes, you can grieve without there being a deeper supernatural meaning, right? A lot of times we have these seemingly supernatural experiences, things like hearing their voices, or maybe hearing movements around the house, or dreaming about the deceased person. And if you think about it, we live in this highly religious society, a society where everybody is, spiritual in some kind of way. They either have a religious belief, or they say, oh, I'm spiritual, but not religious, or, they sort of believe these types of things. And so it makes sense to me. My little quote here says, it is not unreasonable that you, having encountered that way of thinking much of your life, might manifest some of these internalized concepts during your time of extreme vulnerability. Okay, so if you've been told your whole life, oh, dead people will come back to you and speak to you in your dreams, and here you are extremely vulnerable at your weakest point because you've lost somebody extremely significant to you, and you start dreaming about that person, which inevitably you probably will, you know, that memory, that those things are going to come back to your mind, of like people telling you your whole life that dreaming about somebody is a sign that they're trying to speak to you from beyond the grave. So it's not, some of those friends that I told you, that at least one of the friends that I told you I was supporting a couple of years ago, when we both had lost somebody significant. um One of her things was, she felt like she had heard his voice several times, and she's like, oh my gosh, am I going crazy? Is this a God speaking to me? Like, what is going on with me? And and I was explaining to her, like, you are just this your grief is so deep, and it's so extreme right now, that some of these experiences that you're having are, cannot be explained. And and that's okay. It's really just the function of the grief. And you kind of have to wait to see, once the grief itself subsides a little bit, do these things themselves subside and go away. And if as your grief gets better, these things subside and go away, then you know that it was a function of the grief, and it's not some, supernatural thing. And so you can just kind of deal with this stuff, let it come and go. And expect that, because you live in this highly religious society, that that you may have some of these experiences. Another one of my favorite tips, and I'm a little biased, I am a mental health professional, but attend to your psychological and emotional needs. Tip number 4, right? Again, see a counselor. You may have to consider going to, and you may also have to consider going to one who's not a non-believer, right? So a lot of times, a lot of us want a therapist who's a non-believer, or who's secular, or something like that. And again, when you're extremely in a place that's as vulnerable as you would be right now, in this type of situation, you may have to consider, like, getting help where you can get the help, period. um and I talk in the book about the fact that a really good therapist, a good clinician, should be able to put their religious beliefs to the side. Like, you should be able to say to them, I don't believe that stuff. I don't want you to bring that stuff into my counseling session. You should be able to say that to them, and they say, okay, I'll make sure that I sit this over here. Obviously, that doesn't happen. Plenty of people have plenty of bad experiences, I'm aware. Um, but I say that to say, you know, there are also plenty of counselors who out there who will do that if you say that to them. If you don't say that to them, again, like I said on the last slide, this is a highly religious society. They're probably gonna be spiritual in some kind of way, and they're probably gonna assume that you're spiritual in some kind of way. But there are plenty of therapists and counselors and clinicians out there who, if you say to them, don't bring that into into my treatment, they'll go, oh, okay, no problem. but you have to say that up front. And so you may have to consider seeing a therapist who's not explicitly a non-believer, because you really are in need of some, critical support. I also say see a doctor or a psychiatrist. Consider taking some medications. I talk about how meds are for clusters of symptoms, right? We think about meds and we say like, oh, that's like a schizophrenia medication, or this is a bipolar medication. But really, medications treat clusters of symptoms, right? So if you happen to be experiencing a cluster of depression symptoms and this medication happens to work well with that particular cluster of depression symptoms, I don't care what they say it normally treats. We've found that it treats depression symptoms well as well. And so we're going to try it over here with your depression symptoms. And so you may have to be open to trying some medications and trying some things that you had not considered before. Because if you're having difficulty with anxiety, if it's been 3, 4, 5 months and you still can't get out of the bed, if you can't go to work because you having panic attacks every day, if the grief continues to be so disruptive in your life, in 6 months or a year later, if it's so disruptive that you're not able to do attend to your basic daily needs, then you have to start to consider that maybe I need some additional support here in some professional ways. My little quote here says, you should let yourself feel as many feelings as you want to feel, but recognize that there are actions that you can and should take to make yourself resilient, thereby preventing the emotions from consuming and destroying your life. Tip number 6, reconnect with nature. If you know me, if you know anything about me, if you are my Facebook friend, if you know anything, you know that I love to hike, and you know that I love to go outside, and I like to do anything that's outdoors. I like to waterfall jump and kayak and climb mountains and go to Colorado and do 14,000-foot mountains and climb and do the Appalachian Trail and Smoky Mountains. I love it. If I'm outside and I'm getting dirty, I'm happy. So again, I'm a little bit biased here. Tip number 6, reconnect with nature. In the book, I talk a lot about how there's a lot of research that talk about the benefits of reconnecting with nature on our physical and mental health. And so I go through several pieces of research basically there. I talk about a poem, one of my favorite poems, one of my all-time favorite poems is called After Apple Picking by Robert Frost. And it is about nature and how nature reflects life and death. And the poem is about death, and the guy's getting close to the end of his life, and he's contemplating being ready for death. And so that's what that poem is about. And I sort of analyze that a little bit in the book. And then I talk about something called directed attention fatigue and attention restoration theory, and how the idea here is that, we use so much of our conscious, our attention, our conscious attention, like our ability, the parts of us that we control, right? The parts of our attention and our focus that we control, we use that so much that it gets tired. And then when it gets tired, we make bad decisions. We get exhausted. We are not focused. We, begin to, you know how it is when you're tired, right? Just all the bad things that go with being tired and exhausted. And so attention restoration theory says that the way to rejuvenate yourself, basically when you're in that sort of a place, is to go outside, is to get outside, or if you to sort of get yourself in nature in some kind of a way that is different from what is your daily experience. So it could be as simple as sitting on the porch during a rainstorm. It could be as simple as planting a vegetable garden. For me, I need to drive 3, 4 hours away and get into the mountains. I need to go hike along a river somewhere, or sit out by the fire pit, something like that. It could be just going for a bike ride around the neighborhood. Whatever is easy for you and enjoyable for you to do. You wouldn't want to do something that you've never done before. If you've never been camping before, you don't want to say, I'm gonna go camping and use that as the thing that I'm gonna, I'm gonna put a 50-pound backpack on my back and go hiking up into the woods, and I gotta pitch my tent for the first time ever, and I gotta build a fire for the first time ever. You're not gonna be rejuvenated by that. You're gonna come out of the woods mad and angry and irritable. So you would want to do something that's easy for you and enjoyable and pleasant for you to do, that allows you to reconnect with nature. I also discussed some research about heart surgery patients, and how there were the heart surgery patients who had windows in their rooms that they were able to look out and see, like trees and stuff like that. Those patients recovered faster. They used less pain medications. They had fewer complications than heart surgery patients who didn't have windows, or who didn't have windows that overlooked a significant amount of like natural area. And then they also did a similar experiment with heart surgery patients, and the difference was just like nature pictures in the room, pictures of nature in the room, and they found the same thing. The ones who had lots of pictures of nature in their room had better outcomes than the ones who did not. And so, that's just another piece of something, that makes you say, what is going on with us, humans being exposed to nature, and what is going on with that, and how it affects our mental and physical health. Something's going on there. And then tip 10 is really important because, when you think about death and dying and grief and mourning and all this stuff, there's always somebody on the sidelines who's trying to support that person who is grieving, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to help. And so in this particular tip, I get highly practical, highly, what can you do? You should be able to walk away from that chapter with something that you could do immediately to help a person that's dealing with grief. I could pick up my phone and do something right now to help somebody who's grieving, right? Things like, sending notes of encouragement, something that simple. Going to the house and cleaning up for them, babysitting. Really simple, concrete things are the things that will really help when you're grieving, because it's really hard to um, just do the basics on a daily basis. And when I say do the basics, I mean wash my face and brush my teeth. I don't mean the basics like, cook and clean and go to work. I mean the basics like walk from my bed to the toilet. So something like somebody saying, hey, let me pick up your kid for the day and take them to the park and McDonald's for a couple of hours. Like, that can be something that could be, very, very important for somebody who's in the mourning process. In that chapter, I also talk about things like the use of touch. I talk about sex, and I talk about, even how you can support somebody during this time of social distancing. So that chapter is really practical, really meaningful in that way. The last thing that I say in the book, and what I leave with, how I end, is this little piece of advice, I guess. You can make it. This is your new normal. It will get better. You'll make it through this. You will survive. You must survive. This is your new normal. And that is an overview of the book.